Hi. To help you understand how to do an analysis of variance, I've put together a couple of worksheets and I'm creating YouTubes to take you through the worksheets so that you can better understand the ANOVA formula worksheet. So there's a couple of different variations of problems that you have in the back of chapter 12, and we're going to do work a problem for each of them. Number 12 and then also number 19. So the first one we're going to talk about is number 12 here. And the basic data for number 12 is located on page 367 in your book. So if you can, please open that up and follow along. And it's on the bottom of page 367. Number 12 is what we're working with. So the ANOVA formula worksheet is kind of like the sum of squares formula on steroids, the computational formula. I mean, I've included that here on the worksheet to kind of help you better understand the steps about how to do an ANOVA. And so as we work through this worksheet, you'll see that I have included some notations over on the left, and I'll go through those when we get to that point. But here's the whole sum of squares formula. Another thing important to note is that T, which stands for treatment, it's just the sum of the scores in each treatment group, is synonymous with sum of X. And so same type of information, different notation. When we get to ANOVA land, there are some different terms and notations that are used. So hopefully as we work through this worksheet, it'll help you better understand all of that. So if you're taking a look at the problem on number 12, page 367, you'll see that there's 3 treatment groups. And so the first part of the worksheet here is for you to add up the scores for each of the treatment groups. And so for treatment group number 1, the sum of those scores is 16, 24 for treatment group number 2, 32 for treatment group number 3, for a grand total of scores of 72. And then the next part of the worksheet has you record the size of the sample for each of the treatment groups. And so there are 8 scores in each of these 3 treatment groups. And when you calculate the total N, 3 times 8 comes to 24. So now here are the first groupings of the formula steps. And again, I broke out the components, the building blocks of the sum of squares formula, and included those right here on the side. Accompanying the worksheet is a math sheet where I did add up the scores for each of the treatment groups and then also squared each of those scores and calculated the sum of the squares and so forth. And so if you have that open as well to review, it'll help you make sense of where these numbers came from. So basically, once you sum up each of the scores in treatment group 1, and then you take that next step of squaring each of those score values and summing those up, this is where 48 comes from, 96 comes from, and 148 comes from. So the sum of the squared scores for X1, which is also T1, since it's just we're talking about the scores in each treatment group, sum up to those values as well. And then in the final step for this first grouping of formula steps, you just add up 48, 96, and 148, and that's where that 292 comes from. The second step of scores, the next series of formula steps, is the other building block of the sum of squares formula. And that is where the sum of each treatment group, or the sum of X for each treatment group, squared divided by the N for that particular treatment group, and I have those broken out right there. And so 16, that's where 16 came from. 16 squared gives you 256 divided by the N for that particular group comes up to 32. And so that's where each of those values come from. And you add up 32, 72, and 128, and that's where that 232 comes from. So the back of the worksheet, the top part of it, I like to call this kind of a parking place for values to calculate these intermediate quantities right here, intermediate quantity 1. you're just taking the grand total of all of the scores from the first sheet, the G grand total, which is 72, squaring it, and then dividing that by the total number of cases, total number of scores across all three groups, which is 24. And so intermediate quantity number 1 is 216. And then on this worksheet right here, you can make a notation right above this for each of these steps 22 and 23, and maybe make yourself a little note that says no math required, because the only thing where these values come from, the only thing that you have to do is go to line 15 and grab 292, put that there, and from line 20, grab the value 232 and put that there, and that's kind of a parking place for you to be able to work the next few steps. So here, we're calculating the sum of squares total, sum of squares within, sum of squares between, and that is just subtracting these intermediate quantity sums from each other. So intermediate 2 of 292 minus intermediate 1 of 216 is where 76 comes from, and so forth. Intermediate 2 of 292 minus intermediate 3 of 232 is where 60 comes from. So once you've calculated those, sum of squares, total and within and between, the next three steps you're going to be calculating is degrees of freedom between, degrees of freedom within, degrees of freedom total, and K stands for the number of treatment groups. We have 3 treatment groups. K minus 1 gives us a 2. The overall N of 24 minus the number of treatment groups of 3 is where 21 comes from. And then the overall N of 24 minus 1 gives us our DF total of 23. From these 3 steps and these 3 steps, our sum of squares total within and between, and our DF total within and between is where we get the values to calculate our mean square between and our mean square within. So grabbing those numbers from up above, our SS between of 16 divided by our DF between of 2 gives us an 8. And then SS within of 60 divided by DF within of 21 gives us our 2.86. And then our final step to calculate our F-test, our ANOVA, MS between divided by MS within, that is our 8 divided by our 2.86, and that is where our F value of 2.80 comes from. So right down here is the ANOVA table. ANOVA tables are predictive in that the columns add up to the total, so 2 plus 21 adds up to 23. 16, our DF, sum of squares between of 16 and our sum of squares within of 60 adds up to 76. And then there's our mean square values, which is how we calculated our F. So if you understand how ANOVA tables work, in that the columns should add up to the total, and if you get to this point and your column does not add up to the total, then go up and check your math. If you're working using this ANOVA worksheet to do an ANOVA, you must have made a math mistake in a previous step. So we get to this point and we incorporate all of our values into the ANOVA table. And then to find our critical value in the table of critical values for the ANOVA test in Appendix B in the back of your book, you need to know 2 numbers, and that is our degrees of freedom between and our degrees of freedom within. And the book walks you through that as well as my lectures. So 2.80 is our F value, our critical value is 3.47, and so because our F test does not exceed our critical value, then we fail to reject.